Hi everybody, the 6th annual session of the Paris Peace Forum is about to get underway. We actually couldn't be in a more Parisian setting right now. I wish you could see, but the Eiffel Tower is just a few blocks away from us. And I'm here with Vaïsse, who is the founder and Director General of the Forum. Thanks so much for doing this. It's great to see you again.
Welcome to Paris.
Obviously, these conversations are getting underway at a rather fraught time for the world. I wanted to start first by asking you about the theme of the conference, finding common ground in a world of rivalry. There are many rivalries happening. Is there a central one that you're focused on?
Obviously, yes, because it's not entirely a GZERO world. It's also a world that is structured around the US-China competition. And what we've seen, especially in the recent month, is the fact that this competition eats at our capacity, as our ability to do global governance. In other words, competition is getting so fierce that it undermines cooperation. And so what the forum sets out to do is to try to build a space not just for dialogue, but for work on global governance issues, separated, compartmentalized, if you'd like, from that competition. You must remember during the month of February when we had the Chinese balloon overflying US territory and the crisis that ensued. Well, if you remember what John Kerry said after that, it was very cause for concern, because he said that for 2 months he had not been able to work with his Chinese counterpart because of the tensions. And so that's where you see geopolitics eating up at global governance. And so what we're trying to do in this edition is to make progress on these different global questions and make sure that, once again, competition doesn't really completely prevent cooperation.
I'm curious about your philosophy around the world order that seems to be emerging. Are you seeing alignment between, choosing of sides? For example, we have an emergence of India and leaders of the global south who no longer have to necessarily view the world in a bipolar way.
Yes, and they actually actively fight that bipolarity by trying not to choose whatever the slogan or the word or the jargon that they employ, whether it's multi-alignment or non-alignment. I would, not just India, but I think Saudi Arabia obviously is very important, the UAE, Brazil, and a couple of others. And you see varying positioning, whether it's on the Ukraine, the Russia war against Ukraine, or the Israel-Palestine issue. You see various ways. But the idea is that beyond the north-south gap, which is another big element structuring the international system, not just east-west, but also north-south. And the Paris Peace Forum has always been devoted to, being a place where you can mend or where you can improve north-south relations. We're trying to get all the different actors, east, west, north, south, to work on the same issues and to make progress where they have common interests, because that's the paradox of it all, is that we focus on competition and geopolitical rivalry while we forget the iceberg coming our way when we fight on the deck of the Titanic.
I want to ask about those sort of common interests and common ground, which is the other part of the theme of the conference. But first, as you brought up Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, there are parts of the world that have clearly moved beyond rivalry and into all-out war. And I'm just sort of curious, as you begin a peace forum, how that's coloring conversations and the way that you're framing this.
It definitely gives, unfortunately, a very bleak context. So from the start, the forum was always focused on the long-term questions on, crafting peace for the future, rather than intervening on hot crises like the one in Gaza today or Ukraine a year ago. This said, we don't ignore those crises and we do what we can. And what we have to admit, is limited. It's limited because we can mostly do humanitarian work. And so on the November 9, Thursday, November 9, we have this humanitarian conference on Gaza that President Macron has convened in the context of the Paris Peace Forum. And then the next day, when the forum opens, we'll also have a discussion between civil society from Israel and from Palestine, that we hope will at least spark a few, I would say, a few glimmers of hope of getting somewhere in terms of peace, because we know how much the two-state solution has been receding on the horizon in the last 10, 20 years, and how much we still need to have some kind of a horizon to address the Palestinian question.
Beyond kinetic warfare, the world is obviously at an apex in terms of cyber. And I'm curious, cyber has always been a big focus for this forum. How do you view the relationship between cybersecurity and peace globally?
You're right, from the start, which is for us 2018, which was the centenary of World War I, when we commemorated the armistice, we launched very early on the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which is a huge platform of various actors, about a bit more than 80 governments, more than 700 companies, 300 civil society members, local governments and others, working on norms for cybersecurity. So, obviously, we've not solved the issue. We still have cybersecurity issues, but I think it contributes to advancing on rules of war or rules of aggression, because we know even in wars there are rules applied to the cyber domain. What the Paris Call did was to have working groups have a number of principles. And so this year, for example, we're focusing on cyber mercenaries, trying to get probably in the winter or in the spring to a common text or a common position on the employment or the non-employment, ideally, of cyber mercenaries that we know are key to the cyber wars. And these cyber wars, in turn, are part and parcel of current conflicts. You were mentioning kinetic operations. Well, cyber has become part of these kinetic operations. We saw it in Ukraine. We saw it at the very beginning of the terrorist acts of Hamas on October 7. And so regulating this, trying to inject norms and rules of the road in cyber in the cyber domain also contributes to the larger purpose of peace.
So the United States joined the Paris Call that you mentioned in 2021. Depending on the outcome of the 2024 US election, that could potentially be reversed. How concerning is that to you, and do you view the United States' participation in the call as being important?
It is definitely important, and Vice President Harris brought the good news 2 years ago that the US was joining the same day as Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the EU Commission, announced the same. And so for us, really important participation, especially to make progress on all of these different areas. I just mentioned cyber mercenaries. I'm also thinking of defining critical infrastructure and having rules on what attacks on critical infrastructures mean and how they should be banned. Obviously, hospitals, water supply, and these kind of facilities. It's really important that they be there, that the US government be there. 2024, we'll see what happens a year from now on November 5th, 2024. Obviously, I'm concerned that if Trump is re-elected, then, or is elected for a second time, I should say, then we'll have many other big worries than the Paris Call, even though it will be one of the many, many issues that will be put in question by his return to the White House.
When the Paris Call was established in 2018, nobody spoke about generative AI. In fact, that's really been only a development over the course of about the last year. How do you view AI in terms of the context of the call, and what is your sort of position overall on what consensus should look like about its use?
Yeah, so you know what AI does to cyber attacks. It puts them on steroids. That is, it helps cyber attackers write code. AI is wonderful and does all kinds of wonderful things. When it's employed for malicious intents, then it gets things worse very rapidly. And so what we've seen in the recent month especially is AI-generated cyber attacks from the very basic ones, attack and denial of access, for example, but also for more elaborate codes that have been written using ChatGPT or other tools. It's very hard to prevent this, obviously, because it's all the dual use material that you can think of, but it's especially concerning. And I would say, especially looking forward when it's paired with higher capabilities in computing, and obviously the quantum revolution will be the second area of concern. If you have both AI-generated code and quantum computing capability, then we're off to a very sort of dark moment of cybersecurity. All the more reason to band together and to cooperate on trying to have norms against use of cyber attacks.
Final question, common ground. It seems elusive in this time of converging crises and conflict. When this forum is over with, come Sunday morning, what will success look like to you? What are you hoping comes out of this weekend?
So it's a good question. Part of the success of the forum will be all the meetings, whether scheduled or not scheduled, that will have taken place, and the ability to connect people so that they keep working together. So that's the convening magic, if you'd like. But then more concretely, there are a number of things that we're aiming at. So for example, on the big session that we'll have with President Macron, IMF Director Georgieva, President Ruto from Kenya, and many others, Mia Motley from Barbados, is a step towards the reform of international financial institutions, the World Bank in particular, and others, so that we are able to step up support for both poverty and the SDGs and the climate goals. That was started in June. It continues now at the Paris Peace Forum, and so we'll see if there is a change and announcements during this session. I'm also thinking in the same vein about the coal coalition, the Zero Coal Coalition. There's been some work done on coal by governments. Now we're trying to tackle the private sector financing of coal-fired power plants around the world. We know they are really among the worst things that we do to the climate by injecting a lot of CO2 emissions. So that's one thing that we'd particularly like to have. The work that we're doing on critical minerals. We were mentioning competition versus cooperation. You know, obviously the increased competition in critical minerals, or what we call transition minerals, because they're important for the green transition, is making it more difficult to produce them massively, because the market is not fluid, because the market is more and more prevented to play its role because of export controls and things like that. Also because we have very often suboptimal exploitation of mines. That is, we exploit mines for only one mineral, whereas many others are present. And so we're doing things bad from the environmental perspective, but also from the policy perspective. And so we're launching an initiative around critical minerals. So that's what success looks like. And then a number of other priorities, advancing the AI debate, which is very active. And so we'll have a number of participants, Brad Smith from Microsoft, Yann Lequin from Meta. We'll have also other perspective. I'm thinking of science fiction author Chen Chufan, Stanley Chan, who's been an interesting voice contributing to the reflection. So that's more about discussion, conceptualization, and thinking. But it's also an important part of it. And then, many different smaller initiatives. If we manage to tick the box and launch these coalitions, then we'll call it a success.
There was just, of course, a summit on AI that Rishi Sunak called in the UK. The United States has put out several of its own policies and proposals. The UN has convened a sort of a special gathering of advisors to come up with policy proposals. Do you think at some point, or do you hope, I should say, that these groups converge and sort of come to some sort of, this is the path forward?
Yeah, we're still at that moment of discussion, of brainstorming, and we have in real life, I would say what is akin to what the IPCC does in a sense for climate, that is to say an assessment of where we stand regarding facts, and there are various interpretations. If you look at the debates on open versus closed AI, that's a very interesting debate, pitting the school of thought advocating for OpenAI. Yann Lequin from Meta has been an important figure of that school of thought, against others that think that closed systems are better because you can control them better, so they are inherently safer than open ones. So that's a really interesting debate. There are a couple of other angles to that debate, but it's happening under our eyes. And what we wish to do with the work at the Paris Peace Forum is contribute to that. President Macron, before the forum, tonight on November 8, will host a number of guests working on AI, global tech thinkers, if you'd like, that group, and also tech CEOs. And we'll do progress. And then a year from now, we'll have the second, actually the third, but the second in-presence meeting after the London summit, or the Bletchley Park summit, I should say, on AI, perhaps focusing more on sort of more immediate threats than the sort of existential threat that has been taking center stage in the UK summit, and which, is one thing to consider, but probably not the most important political issue where AI is concerned.
Justin Vaïsse, I know you have your work cut out for you, so we'll let you get to it, and best of luck at the forum.
Thank you, and I hope you'll enjoy the forum this year.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.